Before the world collapses, before there are wars, a great flood, or trumpets of judgment echoing across the sky, something happens that most of humanity never notices. It is not a disaster. It is not an invasion. It is not a sudden burst of divine anger. It is the moment order is forgotten. The world once ran with a stability so consistent that people mistook it for something automatic. The sun rose every morning without missing a beat. The moon slipped back into darkness right on time, without hesitation. The stars never argued with their path across the sky. They appeared, moved, and vanished in the right season, at the right time, as if the entire universe obeyed an invisible law no one needed to repeat. The sea did not spill over its shores, even though it carried the power to swallow continents. The wind did not destroy everything in its path, even though it could tear forests apart in an instant. Trees did not demand fruit out of season, and the earth did not refuse to nourish life. Creation obeyed not out of fear, but because obedience was its nature. In that order there was no chaos, no struggle for power, no ambition that reached beyond the place that had been given. And that is why the tragedy of the world did not begin with nature, and it did not begin with humankind. It began with those created to stand in between. Beings who could see the light, understand the order, and were given something the rest of creation did not have: free will. When a being can choose, it can also betray. Collapse does not start with violence, it starts with a thought. A whispered thought, quiet, sliding in through a crack. If I understand the order, why am I not allowed to rise above it? From that moment on, order is no longer seen as sacred, but as a limitation that needs to be broken. Those assigned to guard the boundary no longer stay in their place. They begin to look down at the earthly world, not with responsibility, but with desire. Not with protection, but with the hunger to possess. And when the gaze changes, the role changes with it. The guardian begins to believe he has the right to interfere, the right to decide, the right to rearrange what was never his. From there, order does not collapse immediately. It fractures, quietly, dangerously, like a foundation being hollowed out while the surface still looks intact. That is the moment the world keeps running, but it is no longer safe. Light still shines, but darkness has found an opening to slip in. And when order is forgotten, it is not because it disappears, but because someone begins to believe he no longer needs to bow to it. Greetings and welcome to Prophetic History Explained. If something in this story makes you uneasy, if you feel the world today is standing close to an invisible line, then you are in the right place at the right time. Because this story is not only about a distant past, it is quietly reflecting our present. And right now, before we go deeper into the secrets that have been buried, take a second to subscribe to Prophetic History Explained. Your support does not only help us keep making high-quality content, it helps these forgotten stories be told again, fully, honestly, without distortion. Because once order is forgotten, what comes next is not instant chaos. It is a chain of wrong choices, step by step, leading the world to a place where no one can turn back. And that is only the beginning. Rebellion does not begin with thunder splitting the sky or a loud uprising. It begins in silence, where those assigned to watch have looked at the world for too long and forgotten why they were placed there. They were not created to rule, and they were not given the right to decide the fate of the earthly world. Their role was to guard the boundary, to stand between heaven and earth as faithful witnesses to an order established long before. But standing so close to that boundary planted a dangerous illusion in them. Watching humans live in flesh, multiply, and desire, they began confusing understanding with ownership. They no longer saw humans as beings meant to be guided, but as creatures with something they themselves did not have. The experience of limits, the feelings of the body, and the freedom of living inside a finite span of time. From that moment, the mission becomes distorted. Observation turns into craving. Protection turns into interference. And that interference no longer looks like mercy. It looks like ambition, the ambition to step out of the place they were entrusted with. No one forced them to leave heaven. No power pushed them down. They walked on their own. They chose on their own. And that is why their fall is impossible to excuse. A sin committed in ignorance may be met with mercy, but a sin committed with full awareness carries the weight of rebellion. On a mountaintop where heaven and earth seem closer than anywhere else, they do not just make a personal decision. They make a pact. A collective oath where each one ties himself to the sin of the others. No one is allowed to step back. No one is allowed to regret. If everyone falls together, then no one has to carry the responsibility alone. That is the moment rebellion becomes a system. When the oath is spoken, they lose the right to return, not because heaven shuts its door, but because they turn their backs on it. They abandon what they were, willingly taking on a form that was never theirs, stepping into a world never created to contain them. And from that moment on, they no longer belong to heaven, but they do not truly belong to earth either. They exist in a dangerous in-between, carrying heavenly power without being held by obedience anymore. That is the most dangerous state any being can enter. Having strength, but no moral limit to direct that strength. Their rebellion does not shake the universe right away. The stars still follow their path, time still moves. But one thing has changed in a way that cannot be undone. The boundary has been pierced. And once the boundary between heaven and earth is no longer untouchable, everything beneath it becomes fragile. They do not only break rules, they break roles. Beings created to protect humankind now stand above them, manipulate them, and eventually use them to satisfy their own desire. This is no longer a personal failure. It is the betrayal of a sacred function. In that rebellion, the most frightening part is not the act itself, but how it becomes justified. When everyone is wrong, wrong no longer feels wrong. When every boundary is blurred, crossing the boundary becomes normal. And that normalization of sin opens the door to consequences no finite world can survive. The rebellion of the Watchers is not only a story from a distant heaven, it is an eternal warning about what happens when any being, no matter how elevated, begins to believe that knowledge gives them the right to stand above the order that brought them into existence. When roles are reversed and authority is abused, collapse is no longer a possibility. It becomes inevitable. And from that moment on, the road to corruption is opened, not through instant violence, but through a wrong decision hidden under the language of freedom, a decision whose consequences will spread, sink deep, and eventually sweep up even those who never stood on that mountain. The corruption of the world does not begin the moment the Watchers leave their place. It begins slower, more subtle, and that is why it is far more dangerous. This is when knowledge pours down to earth like rain with no limits, while humans have never been prepared to carry its weight. What is taught is not light that guides the way, but raw power without wisdom. People learn how to forge metal before they learn how to control anger. They learn how to build weapons before they understand justice. In hands that have not been refined, knowledge does not become a tool that serves life. It becomes leverage for ambition. At the same time, secrets of beautifying the body spread like a false promise. Appearance is praised more than inner character. Attraction becomes a new kind of power, and desire is dressed up as something respectable. When people learn to cover emptiness inside with a polished outside, they slowly lose the ability to tell what is real and what is only illusion. Magic, spells, and other forms of invisible manipulation seep into human life, not as mystery, but as quick solutions for natural limits. Instead of accepting finiteness, people try to escape it at any cost. Instead of learning patience, they learn force. And when power is used without reverence, the line between the sacred and the ordinary is erased. Even the sky is no longer something people look up to with humility. The movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars are stripped from their sacred meaning and turned into tools for calculation, prediction, and control of time. When the order of the universe is treated like a machine that can be manipulated, people begin believing nothing is beyond their reach. But knowledge is never neutral. It always magnifies the nature of the one who holds it, and when knowledge is handed to souls that have not been purified, the consequences do not stop at the individual. Beings born from an unnatural union begin to appear as living proof of a broken order. They carry strength beyond what the world needs, ambition beyond what anyone can control, and a hunger that cannot be satisfied. When resources run thin, brutality rises. First comes competition, then oppression, and finally destruction. Humans are no longer threatened by nature, but by what they have accepted and fed. Blood becomes the common language, fear becomes the normal atmosphere, and life, which was made to flourish, is consumed like fuel. The most frightening part is not that knowledge is passed down. It is that humans receive it without asking about the responsibility that comes with it. No one is forced to use that knowledge for violence. No one is required to turn understanding into domination. Corruption happens through repeated choices, small steps, harmless-looking compromises, until no one remembers where the original boundary was. When the earth begins to cry out, it is not the complaint of dust and stone. It is an accusation against a species that turned blessing into a weapon. The world does not collapse from a lack of knowledge. It collapses from a lack of wisdom, the wisdom to put knowledge in its proper place. And in that moment it becomes clear that the problem is no longer only the ones who gave the knowledge, but the ones who chose to use it to feed the darkness. Human corruption is not an accident. It is the inevitable result when power comes before maturity, when understanding is no longer guided by reverence, and when people begin to believe every limit exists only to be broken. And from that blood-soaked ground, something unavoidable begins to form, quietly but surely, the answer of justice. Judgment does not arrive as a burst of uncontrolled anger. It does not appear because God suddenly loses patience, and it is not because sin has just been discovered. Judgment comes when everything has been seen, when nothing is hidden anymore, and when the long silence proves that humans, and those who once stood between heaven and earth, have no intention of turning back. When the earth cries out, it is not the weak complaint of creation. It is an indictment. Blood has sunk so deep that the earth can no longer stay silent. Life has been consumed, order has been twisted, and every boundary that once protected the world from chaos has been erased. That cry does not need amplification because it reaches the gates of heaven directly. And when the gates of heaven open, there is no negotiation. There is no excuse because every act was done with full awareness. There is no confusion because every boundary was known. Those who broke the order cannot claim ignorance, and humans cannot place all blame on those who handed them power. Judgment does not look for a scapegoat, it looks for the truth. What makes judgment terrifying is not the punishment, but how irreversible it is. Once a boundary has been crossed, not everything can be repaired. Some distortions cannot be corrected. They can only be removed so that what remains can live. Those who carried heavenly power and rejected their place are no longer treated as misguided beings, but as traitors to a sacred role. They are not judged like humans because they did not fall in the darkness of ignorance. They fell in the light, and because of that, their sentence has no way back. The beings born from the unnatural union carrying strength beyond the world's limits cannot be allowed to keep existing in bodies that spread violence. Their physical form is erased not out of hatred, but because life cannot be built on the foundation of chaos. But their consequence does not end there. What remains of them, a spirit that belongs neither to heaven nor to earth, becomes a living trace of a cosmic mistake, wandering, disturbing, reminding humanity that some consequences outlast even immediate punishment. And as for humankind, they are not all destroyed, because even in darkness there is still light. Judgment is not meant to erase life. It is meant to separate it. Those who lived by violence, fed ambition, and turned knowledge into domination cannot stand alongside those who chose righteousness inside a twisted world. That separation is not based on ancestry, power, or achievements, but on how each person used the freedom they were given. The great flood is not pointless wrath. It is the final cleansing when every attempt to repair has failed. The waters come to wash away structures rotted at the root, so the world no longer has to carry distortions that cannot be saved. But even inside that cleansing, preservation is still present, not because the majority deserve it, but because righteousness is never forgotten in judgment. What makes judgment justice is not the scale of destruction, but its absolute precision. Every being is placed exactly where their choices have led them. No one is pushed farther than they themselves have walked. No one is punished beyond the boundary they chose to break. And when the waters recede, when the screams fade, the world does not end. It is empty, exhausted, but cleaned. Judgment does not close history. It cuts away the part of history that can no longer carry life. What remains is not random survival, it is seed, the beginning of an order that can be built again. So judgment is not the end of mercy. It is the final boundary of mercy. When mercy can no longer heal, justice must speak. And in the last silence, the world stands before a truth it cannot avoid. Light and darkness cannot coexist forever. One must retreat, so life can continue. After judgment is complete, what remains is not the cold emptiness of destruction, but a different kind of stillness, the stillness of a world returned to its proper order. No more screaming violence, no more crowding ambition, no more false powers wearing the mask of knowledge. The world becomes quiet, as if it is waiting for something promised long ago. Light no longer has to fight to exist. It does not need to hide or defend itself. It is simply there, as if it always belonged here. Order is not invented again. It is restored. What was twisted is placed back where it belongs, not through forced power, but through the absolute authority of righteousness. In that moment, one is named, a name spoken even before time began to move, not as a conqueror and not as a distant judge, but as the center of all arrangement. He does not need to prove his power because everything that exists automatically points back to him. Light does not oppose him, it flows from his presence. Righteousness is no longer the choice of a small minority, no longer the narrow road trampled by the crowd. It becomes the obvious foundation of the restored world. Those who chose light during the age of darkness did not do so because they were stronger than others, but because they refused to compromise with what was wrong even when the price was loneliness, loss, and being misunderstood. They are not honored for perfection, but for staying loyal to truth when truth offered no instant reward. For them, the reward is not new power, it is rest. No more defending, no more proving, no more living in constant alertness. The renewed world does not demand they fight just to exist. It holds them up the way the original order once held up all creation before it was forgotten. Those who chose darkness are no longer present as a rival force. They are not kept around as a warning display, and they are not allowed to exist as an unavoidable part of the new world. Their absence is not continuing punishment. It is the natural outcome of the choice made long ago. When light is fully revealed, there is no space left for what can only survive in the shadow of deception. The restored world is not a place where every painful memory is erased. It is a place where those memories no longer control anything. Wounds that shaped history no longer rule the future. Life is allowed to grow without being strangled by the legacy of violence. Trees bear fruit not because they are forced, but because that is what they do. The earth no longer carries blood, the sea no longer swallows bodies, the sky no longer witnesses the rebellion of false powers. In the new order, every being knows where it belongs. No more creatures trapped between two worlds. No more authority being abused. No more knowledge used for domination. Understanding does not disappear, but it is placed under wisdom. Power is not removed, but it is bound to righteousness. Freedom is not erased, but it is no longer used to destroy the foundation of life itself. The most important part of restoration is not the renewed landscape, but the healed relationship. The distance that once opened between creation and sacred order is no longer a chasm. The presence of the righteous one does not produce fear, because fear only exists when something needs to be hidden. Here, everything is exposed without being destroyed, seen through without being rejected. And in that light, the meaning of the entire story is finally completed. Judgment is not the last chapter of history. It is the doorway into restoration. Destruction is not the goal, it is the means, so life can continue without being distorted. Order returns not as a distant memory, but as a living foundation for a future no longer threatened by the same old failures. The new world does not need protection from darkness because darkness no longer has the right to exist there. And in that deep peace, a truth speaks without needing words. When order is restored, life is finally free. The lesson for us today is very clear. In a world overflowing with knowledge, technology, and power, the question is not what we can do, but what we should do. Every day we stand at invisible boundaries between honesty and compromise, between control and humility, between using knowledge to serve life or using it to dominate others. Applying this story to modern life begins with remembering our limits, respecting moral order, and refusing to trade righteousness for short-term gain. If you feel stories like this help you see the world more deeply, understand history in a different dimension, and ask the basic questions again about the present and the future, join the Prophetic History Explained community. There we explore forgotten histories, ancient revelations, signs of the times, and lessons that still matter for people today. And do not forget to subscribe to Prophetic History Explained to support the channel so we can keep bringing you deep, honest, thoughtful content in the next videos. Your support is how these important stories do not get buried in silence.